it's an easy ask. Have you done the right thing? Have you got the sort of the legislation right? And obviously, I mean, I think this is, we've always said all along that this is a question of evolution, not revolution. We're building on existing mechanisms here to reinforce an overall framework to ensure that the rules are applied in practice and to good effect. That's always been our point of departure. And I wanted to address this in a fairly brief way by picking up on the number of questions that were in the brochure, and to answer them along the lines of yes, and a word that I will be repeating over and over again, which Mr. Cairns also mentioned, is this word balance, the balanced approach. And that's been the key challenge all along for a regulator, to make sure that what we're doing is a balanced approach. And it's been a challenge in all the different aspects. And I will take that perhaps point by point, because I think you mentioned in the questions first the issue of data protection. Actually, curiously enough, the discussions that we've been having in the Council with Member States, this issue of data protection has not been omnipresent. Perhaps that's unsurprising, because we're talking mainly to people who have expertise in anti-money laundering. But it's there, and it's there clearly with respect to what the European Parliament has been working on. And the balance here, the trick that we're trying to pull off here is to make sure that we get the balance right between appropriately protecting data subjects, but at the same time allowing that functioning system of detection of money laundering and terrorist financing. The way we've approached that is not to try and inject the text with established data protection principles. We're not trying to import traces of an existing general framework for data protection into a directive. There have been cases where it has been appropriate to introduce certain clarifications from a data protection point of view, such as, for example, with respect to rules on data protection. But also, perhaps slightly in the other direction, is to make sure that we give clear recognition to the fact that anti-money laundering has a clear public interest ground. So what is being pursued here, the aims of this, are recognised as such when it comes to providing for the necessary derogations when it comes to data protection. There's an issue here as well of financial inclusion that's in the questions. I mean, the balance is here is to, on the one hand, make sure that we keep open avenues which allow for financial inclusion, allowing low value, easy to use, and competitive payment products, even when some of these products may contain features such as anonymity, which perhaps give rise to concerns on the other side with respect to the risks of abuse, the risks that they can be abused by criminals for illicit purposes or whatever. So we've got to try and get the balance right when it comes to, on the one hand, not outlawing these products, not prohibiting these products, but having sensible safeguards in there to make sure that if these products are allowed, then they are there are mitigating measures such as clear purse limits, such as making sure that these cannot be used on an industrial scale to manufacture anonymous payments. There's also this question of the EU framework and the international standards. Again, balance here. Balance is between ensuring consistency, and we want to ensure consistency as to the highest degree possible with what's been agreed internationally. We've been a part of those discussions as well. And there are strong demands from the member states in particular to make sure that we do respect the international standards. And we will do that to the extent where it is not constraining to our own internal market model. That's the balance. And that's the trick sometimes. It's not always easy. Sometimes the way in which those standards are understood and interpreted is not always in the context of, let's say, a rather unique internal market framework. And there are occasions, there are circumstances where we feel that perhaps there is a certain misunderstanding or a certain compromise of internal market principles, and we need to make sure that we do not do things which would then be potentially against the EU treaty. So it's always a question of balance. There's a question of plugging the inadequacies and the loopholes, and here we've got an issue here of ensuring that we are addressing broader risk areas, and the issue of gambling was raised. We actually go beyond the international standards here. We make sure that we have a broad coverage to all gambling services. But at the same time, there are going to be elements when we broaden out our framework where we need to take account of the fact that certain areas of risk are so low that they really should not be part of the framework. That's a difficult, tricky balance, and I fully subscribe to, I think, the approach that Mr. Cairns was putting out there. I think there has to be an assessment made. I don't think that assessment is here and now. The assessment that needs to be made has to be done at a time by the member states through their national risk assessments, and I certainly think that there is a need to make sure and keep a close eye on what's going on so we don't have large block exemptions, and we are exempting only where the risks are negligible or even non-existent. On this issue as well of inadequacies and loopholes, there's been a lot of discussion quite recently about this virtual currencies, the bitcoins, and to what extent, on the one hand, should we be keeping business open, keeping the opportunities open to something which is exciting and new and offers all sorts of possibilities, but on the other hand poses certain risks from a money laundering, from prudential consumer protection side. That's not something that's in the directive right now, but there are a lot of considerations going on quite actively about how to address that kind of loophole. There's an issue of cooperation between authorities. There's a balance here to be struck between making sure that we, on the one hand, respect the fact that member states choose to do things differently. We don't tell them how they need to implement their arrangements to make sure they have a functioning system. We respect the fact that they do things differently, that they give mandates to different types of body or institution to carry out supervision, for example. That's fine. What matters is that this should not cause tensions and difficulties when it comes to cooperation, especially in a cross-border context. So we mustn't let the differences become the obstacles. Beneficial ownership, that's one which has taken up a lot of discussion time. And here we've got a balance to be struck between different approaches. We respect that there are different views on how beneficial ownership can be made transparent towards those that are in a need to know. We respect that. We respect also the fact that there are those that are pushing much more towards very, very open and transparent systems, and somehow we've got to bridge that gap. I think it's that's more difficult perhaps in Council than it is in Parliament, where there seems to be a lot more consensus on that. Risk assessments, that's another one. We've had a lot of debate about whether or not we should be pushing for systems of supranational risk assessment, whether or not the focus should be mainly on the national risk assessment, how much of the information that's contained in the risk assessments should be made publicly available or of use to the obliged entities. All this is a question of getting that balance right. So that's a very brief answer to the questions that were asked. I think I will conclude on a very similar note to what Mr. Cairns concluded. money laundering is it's still a massive problem. It's still a big question, open question as to whether or not this whole complex and costly system has got the balance right between keeping out the criminals and allowing business to function in and customers to have access to financial services. We know how much, or we have an idea how much money is involved in terms of money laundering each year. I think, just to conclude, I think the progressive upgrading of our system to make it ever more resilient to deal with the never-ending ingenuity of criminals who are always trying to exploit the loopholes in the system. That's our objective. Balancing requirements on obliged entities on the one hand and the inconvenience that may give rise to difficulties for citizens when they're trying to open bank accounts, for example, that has to be weighed up against the need to maintain the highest standards and to protect the integrity of the financial system so that we are bringing in wealth and investment into the EU.